Hi, this is David at TED-IELTS, and today I'm going to show you how to give an answer to an IELTS Speaking Part 2 question prompt that asks you to describe a childhood memory. We'll look at some possible cue cards, then explore a little vocabulary and grammar before I give you my sample Band 9 answer. As always, this lesson is divided into chapters to help you study more effectively. You can jump backwards and forwards using the timeline below. But I do recommend that you watch the whole thing for the maximum benefit. Also, I've added subtitles, so feel free to turn those on if you have any difficulty understanding me. Right, let's begin the lesson. Whenever you are given an IELTS speaking cue card, you should try to read it quickly and identify the thing you're supposed to talk about. Here's our cue card for today. It's not a particularly difficult one, but let's look at some of the key information. Basically, you have to talk about a childhood memory. That means something that happened to you in your childhood. This could be almost anything as long as you remember it. It could be an event or something someone said to you, for example. It could be a happy memory, a sad one, or almost any other kind. The cue card does, however, mention one thing that might be important. It says, explain what effect this has had on your life. Well, you could give a potentially great answer and then say it has had no impact on my life, but it might be easier to talk about something that was significant. So consider that when making your choice. Most of us have lots of memories and it might be difficult to choose, but remember that we should pick quickly because we have only 1 minute to prepare. I talked about strategies for succeeding in speaking part 2 in this video up here. You might find it helpful in giving better answers for this part of the test. There's a lot of language that you would need to know when talking about children, but what is most important is that you tailor the language to your specific memory. You're not being asked to talk generally about children in this question, so you don't need to worry about the distinction between a toddler, a preteen, and an adolescent, for example. Instead, think of your own memory and the words and phrases you would need to describe that. Even though the topic appears to be childhood, if you're going to describe a trip to the zoo, for example, it would be more important to know vocabulary about animals. If you wanted to talk about going to a theme park, then the words used would need to incorporate some of that specific language. What is perhaps most important is having a variety of words to talk about memories. Whilst maybe it is easier to talk about childhood, this question is not about being a child, but rather about a single memory. Thus, these phrases might come in handy. You could talk about your memory having a lasting impression on you. You could say that something takes you back, meaning to make you feel as though you're in the past once again. You might say that something escapes you if you cannot remember it, and the opposite of that would be flooding back. Most importantly, though, you need a range of tenses. Talking about childhood obviously requires looking into the past and often requires telling stories. To do this with accuracy, you need to be able to differentiate between different times in the past. Look at this story. Notice how the verb tenses help tell the order of events. Some of these actions occur now in the present, like remember and laugh, and others at various points in the past. By saying had been playing, we mark this action as occurring before coming home from school. Most IELTS candidates fixate on learning new vocabulary because it is easier and they think it will help them to get a better score, but it is important to master verb tenses because without these, you cannot present any accurate meaning. Anyway, let's take a look at my sample Band 9 answer. When I was about 8 years old, my family took a trip to the beach on the other side of the country. It was a small holiday resort that we sometimes visited. We stayed in a caravan near this beautiful horseshoe-shaped bay, and all day I'd play in the sand. Most of the time we were together as a family. We would play games on the beach and have picnics, but it was too cold to ever go swimming. Sometimes I would play on my own. I especially loved looking in rock pools for fish and crabs and other sea life. I don't know why, but it fascinated me back then. On one occasion, I caught loads of crabs in my bucket, and when it was time to go back to the caravan at the end of the day, my mom and dad told me I should put the crabs back in the water. I was really upset because, being a small child, I wanted to keep them. However, they eventually convinced me that if I kept them, they'd die, and so it was best to put them back in the sea, where they'd be happy. I always look back on that time fondly. Those were wonderful, carefree days with my family, and I learned an important lesson that day that has served me well in life. It is important not to be selfish and to consider the feelings of others when making decisions, even if they are just animals. As you saw when I was speaking, I did not answer each part of the cue card in order, but I did give it a logical order so that the listener would be taken through the story naturally and sensibly. I began in a pretty simple way, which is to say, when I was about 8 years old. This helps locate the memory in time for the listener, but also makes it easy for me to continue. I guided the story from one point to the next, letting my own memories take me logically from one thing to the next, and finally brought it to a conclusion, which was showing how the past has affected my life. In terms of vocabulary, you can see that I have used language that is specific to the beach, where my story was set. I said things like horseshoe-shaped bay, which is nice and descriptive. I talked about the things we did there, and even things we did not do, like swimming because the water was too cold. My main idea was about sea life, so I made sure to incorporate specific languages related to that. Rock pools, buckets, crabs, etc. There's nothing fancy here. This is just an English test, not an entrance exam for marine biologists. Finally, let's take 2 sentences from near the end where I began to wrap up my answer. In this sentence, I started with the past simple tense to talk about the time I remembered, then switched over to the present perfect to tie this to the present moment. In the final sentence, I wanted to explain the lesson learned, so I switched to the present simple tense. Remember that vocabulary is great, but accuracy with grammar is also of the utmost importance. If you want to learn more about discussing childhood, then you can check out this post from my website. It has more vocabulary and looks at some sample IELTS speaking questions you can use to practice with. Well, that's all for me today. But earlier this week, I got a notification that my YouTube channel hit 15,000 subscribers. I was incredibly happy to see this, and it really inspires me to keep on making IELTS video lessons like this one. So thank you all so much for your support. My goal with this channel is to provide honest, realistic, and actionable advice that gives everyone an equal chance in advancing towards a higher band score in their next test.